The Island of Dr. MOREAU by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. In the Dinghy of the Lady Vane. I do not propose to add anything to what has already been written concerning the loss of the Lady Vane. As everyone knows, she collided with a derelict when 10 days out of Callao. The longboat, with 7 of the crew, was picked up 18 days afterwards by HMS gunboat Myrtle, and the story of their privations has become almost as well known as the far more terrible Medusa case. I have now, however, to add to the published story of the Lady Vane another as horrible and certainly far stranger. It has hitherto been supposed that the 4 men who were in the dinghy perished, but this is incorrect. I have the best evidence for this assertion. I am one of the 4 men. But in the first place, I must state there were never really 4 men in the dinghy. The number was 3. Constance, who was seen by the captain to jump into the gig, Daily News, March 17th, 1887, luckily for us and unluckily for himself, did not reach us. He came down out of the tangle of ropes under the stays of a smashed bowsprit. Some small rope caught his heel as he let go, and he hung for a moment head downwards, and then fell and struck a block or a spar floating in the water. We pulled towards him, but he never came up. I say luckily for us he did not reach us, and I might also add luckily for himself, for there was only a small beaker of water and some sodden ship's biscuits with us. So sudden had been the alarm, so unprepared the ship for any disaster. We thought the people on the launch we'd better provisioned, though it seems they were not, and we tried to hail them. They could not have heard us, and the next morning when the drizzle cleared, which was not until past midday, we could see nothing of them. We could not stand up to look about us because of the pitching of the boat. The sea ran in great rollers, and we had much ado to keep the boat's head to them. The 2 other men who had escaped so far with me were a man named Helmar, a passenger like myself, and a seaman whose name I don't know, a short, sturdy man for stammer. We drifted, famishing, and after our water had come to an end, tormented by an intolerable thirst for 8 days together. After the 2nd day, the sea subsided slowly to a glassy calm. It is quite impossible for the ordinary reader to imagine those 8 days. He has not, luckily for himself, anything in his memory to imagine with. After the first day, we said little to one another and lay in our places in the boat and stared at the horizon, or watched with eyes that grew larger and more haggard every day, the misery and weakness gaining upon our companions. The sun became pitiless. The water ended on the 4th day, and we were already thinking strange things and saying them with our eyes. But it was, I think, the 6th day before Helmar gave voice to the thing we all had in mind. I remember our voices dry and thin, so that we bent towards one another and spared with our words. I stood out against it with all my might, was rather for scuttling the boat and perishing together amongst the sharks that followed us. But when Helmar said that if his proposal were accepted we should have drink, the sailor came round to him. I would not draw lots, however, and in the night the sailor whispered to Helmar again and again, and I sat in the bows of my clasp knife in my hand, though I doubt I had the stuff in me to fight. And in the morning I agreed to Helmar's proposal, and we handed halfpence to find the odd man. The lot fell upon the sailor, but he was the strongest of us, and he wouldn't abide by it, and attacked Helmar with his hands. They grappled together and almost stood up. I crawled along the boat to them, intending to help Helmar by grasping the sailor's leg. But the sailor stumbled with the swaying of the boat, and the 2 fell upon the gunwale and rolled overboard together. They sank like stones. I remember laughing at that and wondering why I laughed. The laugh caught me suddenly, like a thing from without. I lay across one of the thwarts, for I know not how long, thinking that if I had the strength I would drink sea-water and madden myself to die quickly. And even as I lay there I saw with no more interest than if it had been a picture, a sail come up towards me over the skyline. My mind must have been wandering, and yet I remember all that happened quite distinctly. I remember how my hand swayed with the seas, and the horizon with the sail above it danced up and down. But I also remember as distinctly that I had a persuasion that I was dead, and that I thought what a jest it was they should come too late, by such a little, to catch me in my body. For an endless period, as it seemed to me, I lay with my head on the thwart, watching the dancing schooner. She was a little ship, schooner rigged fore and aft, come up out of the sea. She kept tacking to and fro in a widening compass, but she was sailing dead into the wind. It never entered my head to attempt to attract attention. I do not remember anything distinctly after the sight of her side, until I found myself in a little cabin aft. There's a dim memory of being lifted up the gangway, and of a big round countenance covered with freckles and surrounded with red hair staring at me over the bulwark. I also had a disconnected impression of a dark face with extraordinary eyes close to mine, but that I thought it was a nightmare until I met it again. I fancy I recollect some stuff being poured between my teeth, and that is all. Chapter 2. The Man Who Was Going Nowhere. The cabin in which I found myself was small and rather untidy. A youngish man with flaxen hair, a bristly straw-coloured moustache, and a drooping nether lip was sitting and holding my wrist. For a minute we stared at one another without speaking. He had watery, grey, expressionless eyes. Then just overhead came a sound like an iron bedstead being knocked about, and the low, angry growling of a large animal. At the same time the man spoke again. He repeated his question. "How do you feel now?" I think I said I felt all right. I could not recollect how I'd gotten there. He must have seen the question in my face, for my voice was inaccessible to me. "You were picked up in a boat, starving. The name on the boat was Lady Vane, and there were queer marks on the gunwale." At the same time, my eye caught my hand, so thin it looked like a dirty skin purse full of loose bones, and all the business of the boat came back to me. "Have some of this," said he, and gave me a dose of some scarlet stuff iced. It looked like blood, but it made me feel stronger. "You're in luck," said he, "to get picked up by a ship with a medical man aboard." He spoke with a slobbering articulation and the ghost of a lisp. "What ship is this?" I said slowly, hoarse from my long silence. "It's a little trader from Arica and Calais. I never asked where she came from in the beginning. Out of the land of born fools, I guess. I'm a passenger myself from Arica. The silly ass who owns her, he's captain too, named Davis. He's lost his certificate or something. You know the kind of man, calls the thing the Ipecacuana of all the silly infernal names. Though there's much of a sea without any wind, he certainly acts accordingly." Then the voice overhead began again. A snarling growl and the voice of a human being together. Then another voice telling some heaven-forsaken idiot to desist. "You're nearly dead," said my interlocutor. "It was a very near thing indeed, but I put some stuff into you now. Notice your arm's sore? Injections. You've been insensible for nearly 30 hours. I thought slowly. I was distracted now by the yelping of a number of dogs. "May I have solid food?" I asked. "Thanks to me," he said. "Even now the mutton's boiling." "Yes," I said with assurance. "I could eat some mutton." "But," said he, with a momentary hesitation, "you know, I'm dying to hear how you came to be alone in that boat." I thought I detected a certain suspicion in his eyes. "Damn that howling!" He suddenly left the cabin, and I heard him in violent controversy with someone who seemed to talk gibberish in response to him. The matter sounded as though it had ended in blows, but in that I thought my ears were mistaken. Then he shouted at the dogs and returned to the cabin. "Well," said he in the doorway, "you were just beginning to tell me." I told him my name, Edward Prendick, and how I had taken to natural history as a relief from the dullness of my comfortable independence. He seemed interested in us. I've done some science myself. I did my biology at University College. Getting out the ovary of the earthworm and the radula out of the snail and all that. Lord, it's 10 years ago. But go on. Tell me about the boat. He was evidently satisfied with the frankness of my story, which I told in concise sentences enough, for I felt horribly weak. And when it was finished, he reverted presently to the topic of natural history and his own biological studies. He began to question me closely about Tottenham Court Road and Gower Street. Is Kaplatzi still flourishing? What a shop that was. He'd evidently been a very ordinary medical student and drifted incontinently to the topic of the music halls. He told me some anecdotes. Left it all, he said. 10 years ago, how jolly it all used to be. I made a young ass of myself. Played myself out before I was 21. I dare say it's different now. But I must look up that ass of a cook and see what he's doing with your mutton. The growling overhead was renewed so suddenly and with such savage anger that it startled me. What's that? I called after him, but the door had closed. He came back again with the boiled mutton, and I was so excited by the appetizing smell that I forgot the noise of the beast forthwith. After a day of alternate sleep and feeding, I was so far recovered as to be able to get from my bunk to the scuttle and see the green seas trying to keep pace with us. I judged the schooner was running before the wind. Montgomery, for that was the name of the flaxen-haired man, came in again as I stood there, and I asked him for some clothes. He lent me some duck things of his own, for those I had worn on the boat, he said, had been thrown overboard. They were rather loose for me. He was large and long in the limbs. He told me casually that the captain was 3 parts drunk in his own cabin. As I assumed the clothes, I began asking some questions about the destination of the ship. He said the ship was bound to Hawaii, but it had to land him first. Where? Said I. It's an island, where I live. So far as I know, it doesn't have a name. He stared at me, with his nether lip drooping, and looked so wilfully stupid all of a sudden that it came to my head that he desired to avoid any questions. I'm ready, I said, and he let me out of the cabin. Chapter 3. The Strange Face. At the companion was a man obstructing our way. He was standing on the ladder with his back to us, peering over the combing of the hatchway. He was, I could see, a misshapen man, short, broad, and clumsy, with a crooked back, a hairy neck, and a head sunk between his shoulders. He was dressed in dark blue serge, and had particularly thick, coarse black hair. I heard the unseen dogs growl furiously, and forthwith he ducked back, coming into contact with the hand I put out to fend him off from myself. He turned with animal swiftness. The black face thus flashed upon me, startling me profoundly. It was a singularly deformed one. The facial part projected, forming something dimly suggestive of a muzzle, and the huge, half-open mouth showed as big white teeth as I've ever seen in a human mouth. His eyes were bloodshot at the edges, with scarcely a rim of white around the hazel pupils. There was a curious glow of excitement in his face. "Confound you," said Montgomery. "Why the devil don't you get out of the way?" The black-faced man started inside without a word. I went on up the companion, still staring at him almost against my will as I did so. Montgomery stayed at the foot for a moment. "You have no business here, you know," he said in a deliberate tone. "Your place is forward." The black-faced man cowered. They won't have me forward." He spoke with a hoarse quality in his voice. "Won't have you forward?" said Montgomery in a menacing voice. "But I tell you to go." He was on the brink of saying something further. Then he looked up at me suddenly, and followed me up the ladder. I had paused halfway through the hatchway, looking back, still astonished beyond measure at the grotesque ugliness of this black-faced creature. I'd never beheld such a repulsive and extraordinary face before. And yet, if the contradiction is credible, I experienced at the same time an odd feeling that in some way I had already encountered exactly the features and gestures that now amazed me. Afterwards, it occurred to me that probably I'd seen him as I was being lifted aboard, and yet that scarcely satisfied my suspicion of a previous acquaintance. Yet how could one have set eyes on so singular a face and have forgotten the precise occasion past my imagination? Montgomery's movement to follow me released my attention, and I turned and looked about me at the flush deck of the schooner. I was already half prepared by the sounds I'd heard for what I saw. Certainly I had never beheld a deck so dirty. It was littered with scraps of carrot, shreds of green stuff, and indescribable filth. Fastened by chains in the mainmast were a number of grisly staghounds, which now began leaping and barking. And by the mizzen, a huge puma was cramped in a little iron cage far too small to give it turning room. Further, under the starboard bulwark, were some big hutches containing a number of rabbits, and a solitary llama was squeezed in, a mere box of a cage forward. The dogs were muzzled by leather straps. The only human being on deck was a gaunt and silent sailor at the wheel. The patched and dirty spankers were tense before the wind, and up aloft the little ship seemed carrying every sail she had. The sky was clear, the sun midway down the western sky. Long waves, capped by the breeze of froth, were running with us. We went past the steersman on the taffrail, and stared side by side for a space at the water foaming under the stern and the bubbles dancing and vanishing in her wake. I turned and surveyed the unsavoury length of the ship. "Is this an ocean menagerie?" said I. "Looks like it," said Montgomery. "What are these beasts for? Merchandise? Curios? Does the captain think he's going to sell them somewhere in the South Seas?" "Looks like it, doesn't it?" said Montgomery, and turned towards the wake again. Suddenly we heard a yelp and a volley of furious blasphemy coming from the companion hatchway, and the deformed man with the black face clambered up hurriedly. He was immediately followed by a heavy red-haired man in a white cap. At the sight of the former, the staghounds, had all tired of barking at me by this time, became furiously excited, howling and leaping against their chains. The man hesitated before them, and this gave his red-haired pursuer time to come up with him and deliver a tremendous blow between the shoulder blades of his fist. The poor devil went down like a felled ox and rolled in the dirt amongst the furiously excited dogs. It was lucky for him they were muzzled. The red-haired man gave a yawp of exultation and stood staggering, as it seemed to me in serious danger of either going backwards down the companionway or forwards upon his victim. As soon as the second man had appeared, Montgomery had started violently. "Steady on now," he cried, in a tone of remonstrance. A couple of sailors appeared in the forecastle. The deformed man, howling in a singular voice, rolled under the feet of the dogs. No one attempted to help him. The brutes did their best to worry him, butting their muzzles at him. There was a quick dance of their little grey bodies over his clumsy, prostrate figure. The sailors forward shouted to them as though it was an admirable sport. Montgomery gave an angry exclamation and went striding down the deck, and I followed him. In another second, the deformed figure had scrambled up and was staggering forward. He stumbled against the bulwark by the main shrouds, where he remained panting and glaring over his shoulder at the dogs. The red-haired man laughed a satisfied laugh. "Look here, Captain," said Montgomery, his lisp a little accentuated, gripping the elbows of the red-haired man. "This won't do." I stood beside Montgomery. The captain came half round and regarded him with the dull and solemn eyes of a drunken man. "What won't do?" he said, and added after looking sleepily into Montgomery's face for a minute. "Blasted sawbones." With a sudden movement, he shook his arms free, and after 2 ineffectual attempts, stuck his freckled fists into his side pockets. "That man's a passenger," said Montgomery. "I'd advise you to keep your hands off him." "Go to hell," said the captain loudly. He suddenly turned and staggered towards the side. "I'd do what I like on my own ship," he said. I think Montgomery might have left him then, seeing the brute was drunk, but he turned a shade paler and followed the captain to the bulwark. "Look here, Captain, that man of mine is not to be ill-treated. He's been hazed ever since he came aboard." For a minute, alcoholic fumes kept the captain speechless. "Blasted sawbones," was all he considered necessary. I could see that Montgomery had an ugly temper, and I saw too that this quarrel had been some time growing. "The man's drunk," said I, perhaps officiously. "He'll do no good." Montgomery gave an ugly twist of his dropping lip. "He's always drunk. You think that excuses his assaulting the passengers?" "My ship," began the captain, waving his hand unsteadily towards the cages, "was a clean ship. Look at it now." It was certainly anything but clean. "Crew," continued the captain. "Clean, respectable crew." "You agreed to take the beasts." "I wish I'd never set eyes on your infernal island. What the devil you want beasts for on an island like that? Then there's that man of yours. I understand he's a man. He's a lunatic, and he hasn't got any business aft. You think this whole damn ship belongs to you?" "Your sailors began to haze that poor devil as soon as he came aboard." "That's just what he is. He's a devil. An ugly devil. My men can't stand him. And I can't stand him. None of us can stand him. Nor you either." Montgomery turned away. "You leave that man alone anyhow," he said, nodding his head as he spoke. But the captain meant to quarrel now. He raised his voice. "If he comes to this end of the ship again, I'll cut his insides out, I tell you. I'll cut out his blasted guts. Who are you to tell me what I'm to do? I tell you, I'm the captain of this ship, captain and owner. I'm the law here. I tell you, the law and the prophets. I bargained to take a man and his attendant to and from Arica and bring back some animals. I never bargained to take a mad devil and a silly sawbones. Well, never mind what he called Montgomery. I saw the latter take a step forward and interposed. "He's drunk," said I. The captain began some abuse even fouler than the last. "Shut up," I said, turning on him sharply, for I'd seen danger in Montgomery's white face. With that, I brought the downpour on myself. However, I was glad to avert what was uncommonly near a scuffle, even at the price of the captain's drunken ill will. I do not think I've ever heard such vile language come in a continuous stream from any man's lips before, though I have frequented eccentric company before. I've found some of it hard to endure, though I am a mild-tempered man. But certainly when I told the captain to shut up, I had forgotten I was merely a bit of human flotsam, cut off from my resources and with my fare unpaid, a mere casual dependent on the bounty or speculative enterprise of the ship. He reminded me of it with considerable vigour, but at any rate, I prevented a fight. Chapter 4. At the schooner's rail. That night, land was sighted after sundown, and the schooner hove to. Montgomery intimated that this was his destination. It was too far to see any details. It seemed to me then simply a low-lying patch of dim blue in the uncertain blue-grey sea. An almost vertical streak of smoke went up from it into the sky. The captain was not on deck when it was sighted. After he'd vented his wrath on me, he'd staggered below, and I understand he went to sleep on the floor of his own cabin. The mate practically assumed the command. He was the gaunt, taciturn individual we'd seen at the wheel. Apparently he too was in an evil temper with Montgomery. He took not the slightest notice of either of us. We dined with him in a sulky silence after a few ineffectual efforts on my part to talk. It struck me, too, that the men regarded my companion and his animals in a singularly unfriendly manner. I found Montgomery very reticent about his purpose of these creatures and about his destination, and though I was sensible of a growing curiosity, I did not press him. We remained talking on the quarterdeck until the sky was thick with stars. Except for an occasional sound in the yellow-lit forecastle and a movement of the animals now and then, the night was very still. The puma lay crouched together, watching us with shining eyes, a black heap in the corner of its cage. The dogs seemed to be asleep. Montgomery produced some cigars. He talked to me of London, in a tone of half-painful reminiscence, asking all kinds of questions about changes that had taken place. He spoke like a man who had loved his life there, and had been suddenly and irrevocably cut off from it. I gossiped as well as I could of this and that. All the time the strangeness of him was shaping itself in my mind, and as I talked I peered at his odd pallid face in the dim light of the binnacle lantern behind me. There I looked out at the darkling sea, where in the dimness his little island lay hidden. This man, it seemed to me, had come out of immensity, merely to save my life. Tomorrow he'd drop over the side and vanish again from my existence. Even had it been under commonplace circumstances, it would have made me a trifle thoughtful. But in the first place was the singularity of an educated man living in an unknown little island, and coupled with that the extraordinary nature of his luggage. I found myself repeating the captain's question. What did he want with the beasts? Why, too, had he pretended they were not his when I had remarked about them at first? Then again, in his personal attendant, there was a bizarre quality that had impressed me profoundly. These circumstances threw a haze of mystery around the man. They laid hold of my imagination and hampered my tongue. Towards midnight our talk of London died away, and we stood side by side leaning over the bulwark and staring dreamily over the silent starlit sea, each pursuing his own thoughts. It was the atmosphere for sentiment, and I began upon my gratitude. "If I may say it," said I after a time, "you've saved my life." He was on the point of beginning, and then he shook his head doubtfully. "Don't," said I. "It's all the same to me. After all, it's better to keep your secret. There's nothing gained but a little relief if I respect your confidence, and if I don't, well—" He grunted undecidedly. I felt I had him at a disadvantage, had caught him in the mood of indiscretion, and to tell the truth, I was not curious to learn what might have driven a young medical student out of London. I have my imagination. I shrugged my shoulders and turned away. Over the taffrail leant a silent black figure watching the stars. It was Montgomery's strange attendant. It looked over its shoulder quickly with my movement, and then looked away again. It may seem a little thing to you, perhaps, but it came like a sudden blow to me. The only light near us was a lantern at the wheel. The creature's face was turned for just one brief instant out of the dimness of the stern towards its illumination, and I saw that the eyes that glanced at me shone with a pale green light. I did not know then that a reddish luminosity, at least, is not uncommon to human eyes. The thing came to me as a stark inhumanity. That black figure with its eyes of fire struck down through all my adult thoughts and feelings, and for a moment the forgotten horrors of childhood came to mind. Then the effect passed as it had come. An uncouth black figure of a man, a figure of no particular import, hung over the taffrail against the starlight, and I found Montgomery was speaking to me. "I'm thinking of turning in, then," said he, "if you've had enough of this." I answered him incongruously. We went below, and he wished me good night at the door of his cabin. That night I had some very unpleasant dreams. The waning moon rose late. Its light struck a ghostly faint white beam across my cabin and made an ominous shape on the planking by my bunk. Then the staghounds woke and began howling and baying, so I dreamt fitfully and scarcely slept until the approach of dawn. Chapter 5. The Landing on the Island. In the early morning, it was the second morning after my recovery. I believe the fourth after I'd been picked up. I awoke through an avenue of tumultuous dreams of guns and howling mobs, and became sensible of a hoarse shouting above me. I rubbed my eyes and lay listening to the noise, doubtful for a little while of my whereabouts. Then came a sudden pattering of bare feet, the sound of heavy objects being thrown about, a violent creaking and rattling of chains. I heard the swish of water as the ship was suddenly brought around, and a foamy yellow-green wave flew across the little round window and left it streaming. I jumped into my clothes and went on deck. As I came up the ladder, I saw against the flushed sky, for the sun was just rising, the broad back and red hair of the captain, and over his shoulder the puma spinning from a tackle rigged onto the mizzen spanker boom. The poor brute seemed horribly scared, and crouched in the bottom of his little cage. "Overboard with them," bawled the captain. "Overboard with them! We'll have a clean ship soon of the whole billion of them." He stood in the way, so I had to perforce to tap his shoulder to come on deck. He came around with a start and staggered back a few paces to stare at me. It needed no expert eye to tell the man was still drunk. "Hello," said he stupidly, and then with a light coming into his eyes. "Why, it's Mr. "Prendick," said I. "Prendick be damned," said he. "Shut up, that's your name. Mr. Shut up." There was no good answering the brute, but I certainly did not expect his next move. He held out his hand to the gangway by which Montgomery stood talking to a massive white-haired man in dirty blue flannels who had apparently just come aboard. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shut up! That way!" roared the captain. Montgomery and his companion turned as he spoke. "What do you mean?" said I. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shut up! That's what I mean. Overboard, Mr. Shut up, and sharp. We're cleaning the ship out. Cleaning the whole blessed ship out, and overboard you go." I stared at him, dumbfounded. Then it occurred to me it was exactly the thing I wanted. The lost prospect of a journey as sole passenger of this quarrelsome sot was not one to mourn over. I turned towards Montgomery. "Can't have you," said Montgomery's companion. "You can't have me," said I, aghast. He had the squarest and the most resolute face I'd ever set eyes upon. "Look here," I began, turning to the captain. "Overboard," said the captain. "This ship ain't for beasts and cannibals, and worse than beasts any more. Overboard you go, Mr. Shut up. If they can't have you, you goes adrift. But anyhow, you go. With your friends. I've done with this blasted island forevermore. Amen. I've had enough of it." "But Montgomery," I appealed. He distorted his lower lip and nodded his head hopelessly at the grey-haired man beside him to indicate his powerlessness to help me. "I'll see to you presently," said the captain. Then began a curious three-sided altercation. Alternately, I appealed to one and another of the three men, first to the grey-haired man to let me land, and then to the drunken captain to keep me aboard. I even bawled entreaties to the sailors. Montgomery said never a word, and he shook his head. "You're going overboard, I tell you," was the captain's refrain. "Law be damned! I'm king here." At last, I must confess, my voice suddenly broke in the middle of a vigorous threat. I felt a gust of hysterical petulance, and I went aft and stared dismally at nothing. Meanwhile, the sailors progressed rapidly with the task of unshipping the packages and caged animals. A large launch with 2 standing lugs lay under the lee of the schooner, and into this the assortment of goods was swung. I did not then see the hands from the island that were receiving the packages, for the hull of the launch was hidden from me by the side of the schooner. Neither Montgomery nor his companion took the slightest notice of me, but busied themselves in assisting and directing the 4 or 5 sailors who were unloading the goods. The captain went forward, interfering rather than assisting. I was alternatively despairful and desperate. Once or twice, as I stood waiting there for things to accomplish themselves, I could not resist an impulse to laugh at my miserable quandary. I felt all the wretcheder for the lack of a breakfast. Hunger and a lack of blood corpuscles take all the manhood from a man. I perceived pretty clearly that I had not the stamina either to resist what the captain chose to do to expel me, or to force myself upon Montgomery and his companion. So I waited passively upon fate, and the work of transferring Montgomery's possessions to the launch went on as if I didn't exist. Presently that work was finished, and then came a struggle. I was hauled, resisting weakly enough, to the gangway. Even then I noticed the oddness of the brown faces of the men who were with Montgomery in the launch. The launch was fully laden, and was shoved off hastily. A broadening gap of green water appeared under me, and I pushed back with all my strength to avoid falling headlong. The hands in the launch shouted derisively, and I heard Montgomery cursing at them, and then the captain, the mate, and one of his seamen helping him ran me aft towards the stern. The dinghy of the Lady Vane had been towing behind. It was half full of water, had no oars, and was quite unvictualled. I refused to go aboard, and flung myself full length on the deck. In the end, they swung me into her by a rope, for they had no stern ladder, and cut me adrift. I drifted slowly from the schooner. In a kind of stupor, I watched all hands take to the rigging, and slowly but surely she came round to the wind. The sails fluttered and then belled out as the wind came into them. I stared at her weather-beaten side, heeling steeply towards me, and then she passed out of my range of view. I did not turn my head to follow her. At first I could scarcely believe what had happened. I crouched in the bottom of the dinghy, stunned and staring blankly at the vacant, oily sea. Then I realized I was in that little hell of mine again, now half swamped. Looking back over the gunwale, I saw the schooner standing away from me, with the red-haired captain mocking me over the taffrail, and turning towards the island, I saw the launch growing smaller as she approached the beach. Abruptly, the cruelty of this desertion became clear to me. I had no means of reaching the land, unless I could chance to drift there. I was still weak, you must remember, from my exposure in the boat. I was empty and very faint, or I should have had more heart. But as it was, I suddenly began to sob and weep as I'd never done since I was a little child. The tears ran down my face. In a passion of despair, I struck my fists against the water at the bottom of the boat and kicked savagely at the gunwale. I prayed aloud to God that he would let me die. Chapter 6. The Evil-Looking Boatman. But the islanders, seeing I was really adrift, took pity on me. I drifted very slowly to the eastward, approaching the island slantingly, and presently I saw with hysterical relief the launch come round and return towards me. She was heavily laden, and as she drew near I could make out Montgomery's white-haired, broad-shouldered companion, sitting cramped up with the dogs and several packing cases in the stern sheets. This individual stared fixedly at me without moving or speaking. The black-faced cripple was glaring at me as fixedly in the bows near the Puma. There were 3 other men besides, strange, brutish-looking fellows, at whom the staghounds were snarling savagely. Montgomery, who was steering, brought the boat by me, and rising, caught and fastened my painter to the tiller to tow me, for there was no room aboard. I had recovered from my hysterical phase by this time, and answered his hail as he approached bravely enough. I told him the dinghy was nearly swamped, and he reached me a piggin. I was jerked back as the rope tightened between the boats. For some time I was busy bailing. It was not until I'd got the water under, for the water in the dinghy had been shipped, the boat was perfectly sound, that I had leisure to look at the people in the launch again. The white-haired man, I found, was still regarding me steadfastly, but with an expression, as I now fancied, of some perplexity. When my eyes met his, he looked down at the staghounds that sat between his knees. He was a powerfully built man, as I have said, with a fine forehead and rather heavy features. But his eyes had that odd drooping of the skin above the lids that often comes with advancing years, and the fall of his heavy mouth at the corners gave him an expression of pugnacious resolution. He talked to Montgomery in a tone too low for me to hear. From him my eyes travelled to his 3 men, and a strange crew they were. I saw only their faces, and yet there was something in their faces, I knew not what, that gave me a spasm of disgust. I looked steadily at them, and the impression did not pass, though I failed to see what occasioned it. They seemed to me then to be brown men, but their limbs were oddly swathed in some thin, dirty white stuff down there, even to their fingers and feet. I've never seen men so wrapped up before, and women so only in the East. They wore turbans, too, and thereunder peered out their elfin faces at me, faces of protruding lower jaws and bright eyes. They had lank black hair, almost like horsehair, and seemed as they sat to exceed in stature any race of men I'd seen before. The white-haired man, who I knew was a good 6 feet in height, sat a head below any one of the 3. I found out afterwards that really none were taller than myself, but their bodies were abnormally long, and the thigh part of the leg short and curiously twisted. At any rate, they were an amazingly ugly gang, and over the heads of them, under the forward lug, peered the black face of the man whose eyes were luminous in the dark. As I stared at them, they met my gaze, and then first one and then another turned away from my direct stare and looked at me in an odd, furtive manner. It occurred to me that I was perhaps annoying them, and I turned my attention to the island we were approaching. It was low and covered with thick vegetation, chiefly of the inevitable palm trees. From one point a thin white thread of vapour rose slantingly to an immense height, and then frayed out like a down feather. We were now within the embrace of a broad bay, flanked on either hand by a low promontory. The beach was of a dull grey sand and sloped steeply up to a ridge perhaps 60 or 70 feet above sea level, and irregularly set with trees and undergrowth. Halfway up was a square stone enclosure that I found subsequently was built partly of coral and partly of pumiceous lava. 2 thatched roofs peeped from within the enclosure. A man stood awaiting us at the water's edge. I fancied while we were still far off that I saw some other and very grotesque-looking creatures scuttle into the bushes upon the slope, but I saw nothing of these as we drew nearer. The man was of a moderate size, with a dark face. He had a large, almost lipless mouth, extraordinarily lank arms, long, thin feet and bow legs, and stood with his heavy face thrust forward, staring at us. He was dressed like Montgomery and his white-haired companion, in jacket and trousers of blue serge. As we came still nearer, this individual began to run to and fro on the beach, making the most grotesque movements. At a word of command from Montgomery, the 4 men in the launch sprang up with singular awkward gestures and struck the lugs. Montgomery steered us round into a narrow little dock excavated in the beach. Then the man on the beach hastened towards us. This dock, as I call it, was merely a ditch just long enough at this phase of the tide to take the longboat. I heard the bows ground in the sand, staved the dinghy off the rudder of the big boat with my piggin, and freeing the painter, landed. The 3 muffled men with the clumsiest movements scrambled out upon the sand, and forthwith set to landing the cargo, assisted by the man on the beach. I was struck especially with the curious movements of the legs of the 3 swathed and bandaged boatmen. Not stiff they were, but disjointed, distorted in some odd way, almost as if they were jointed in the wrong places. The dogs were still snarling and strained at their chains after these men, as the white-haired man landed with them. The three big fellows spoke to one another in odd, guttural tones, and the man who had waited for us on the beach began chattering to them excitedly. A foreign language, I fancied, as they laid hands on some bales piled near the stern. Somewhere I'd heard such a voice before, and I couldn't think where. The white-haired man stood holding in a tumult of 6 dogs and bawling orders over the din. Montgomery, having unshipped the rudder, landed likewise, and all set to work at unloading. I was too faint while of my long fast and the sun beating down on my bare head to offer any assistance. Presently, the white-haired man seemed to recollect my presence, and he came up to me. "You look," said he, "as though you have not breakfasted." His little eyes were a brilliant black under his heavy brows. "I must apologize for that. Now you are our guest, we must make you comfortable, though you're uninvited, as you know." He looked keenly into my face. "Montgomery says you're an educated man, Mr. Prendick. He says you know something of science. May I ask what that signifies?" I told him I had spent some years at the Royal College of Science and had done some research in biology under Huxley. He raised his eyebrows slightly at that. "That alters the case a little, Mr. Prendick," he said with a trifle more respect in his manner. "As it happens, we are biologists here. This is a biological station of a sort." His eyes rested on the men in white, who were busy hauling the puma on rollers towards the walled yard. "I and Montgomery, at least," he added. Then, "When you'll be able to get away, I can't say. We're off the track to anywhere. We see a ship once in a 12-month or so." He left me abruptly and went up the beach past his group, and I think he entered the enclosure. The other 2 men were with Montgomery, erecting a pile of smaller packages in a low-wheeled truck. The llama was still in the launch with the rabbit hutches, the staghound still lashed to the thwarts. The pile of things completed, all 3 men laid hold of the truck and began shoving the ton weight or so upon it after the puma. Presently Montgomery left them, and coming back to me held out his hand. "I'm glad," said he, "for my own part. That captain was a silly ass. He'd have made things lively for you." "It was you," I said. "It saved me again." "That depends. This island is an infernally rum place, I promise you. I'd watch my goings carefully if I were you. He hesitated, and seemed to alter his mind about what was on his lips. "I wish you'd help me with these rabbits," he said. His procedure with the rabbits was singular. I waded in with him and helped him lug one of the hutches ashore. No sooner was that done than he opened the door of it, and tilting the thing on one end, turned its living contents out into the ground. They fell in a struggling heap, one on top of another. He clapped his hands, and forthwith they went off with that hopping run of theirs, 15 or 20 of them, I should think, up the beach. "Increase and multiply, my friends," said Montgomery. "Replenish the island. Hitherto we've had a certain lack of meat here." As I watched them disappearing, the white-haired man returned with a brandy flask and some biscuits. "Something to go on with, Prendick," said he in a far more familiar tone than before. I made no ado, but set to work on the biscuits at once, while the white-haired man helped Montgomery to release about a score more of the rabbits. 3 big hutches, however, went up to the house of the puma. The brandy I did not touch, for I'd been an abstainer since birth. Chapter 7. The Locked Door. The reader will perhaps understand that at first everything was so strange about me, and my position was the outcome of such unexpected adventures, that I had no discernment of the relative strangeness of this or that thing about me. I followed the llama up the beach, and was overtaken by Montgomery, who asked me not to enter the stone enclosure. I noticed then that the puma in its cage and the pile of packages had been placed outside the entrance to the quadrangle. I turned and I saw that the launch had now been unloaded and run out again and beached, and the white-haired man was walking towards us. He addressed Montgomery. "And now comes the problem of this uninvited guest. What are we to do with him?" "He knows something of science," said Montgomery. "I'm itching to get to work again with this new stuff," said the grey-haired man, nodding towards the enclosure. His eyes grew brighter. "I dare say you are," said Montgomery in anything but a cordial tone. "We can't send him over there, and we can't spare the time to build him a new shanty, and we certainly can't take him into our confidence just yet." "I'm in your hands," said I. I had no idea what he meant by over there. "I've been thinking the same things," Montgomery answered. "There's my room with the outer door." "That's it," said the elder man, looking at Montgomery, and all three of us went towards the enclosure. "I'm sorry to make a mystery, Mr. Prendick, but you'll remember you're uninvited. Our little establishment here contains a secret or so. It's a kind of Bluebeard's chamber, in fact. Nothing very dreadful, really, to a sane man. But just now, we don't know you." "Decidedly," said I. "I should be a fool to take offence of any want of confidence." He twisted his heavy mouth into a faint smile. He was one of those saturnine people who smile with the corners of their mouth down, and bowed to this acknowledgment of my compliance. The main entrance to the enclosure was passed. It was a heavy wooden gate framed in iron and locked, with the cargo of the launch piled outside, and at the corner we came to a small doorway I had not previously observed. The grey-haired man produced a bundle of keys from the pocket of his greasy blue jacket, opened this door and entered. His keys and the elaborate locking up of the place, even while it was still under his eye, struck me as peculiar. I followed him, and found myself in a small apartment, plainly but not uncomfortably furnished, and with its inner door, which was slightly ajar, opening onto a paved courtyard. This inner door Montgomery at once closed. A hammock was slung across the darker corner of the room, and a small unglazed window, defended by an iron bar, looked out towards the sea. This, the grey-haired man told me, was to be my apartment, and the inner door which, for fear of accidents, he said, he would lock on the other side, was my limit inwards. He called my attention to a convenient deck chair before the window, and to an array of old books. Chiefly I found surgical works and editions of the Latin and Greek classics, languages I cannot read with any comfort, on a shelf near the hammock. He left the room by the outer door, as if to avoid opening the inner door again. "We usually have our meals in here," said Montgomery, and then, as if in doubt, he went after the other. "MOREAU!" I heard him call, and for a moment I don't think I noticed. Then, as I handled the books on the shelf, it came up in my consciousness. Where had I heard the name of MOREAU before? I sat down before the window, took out the biscuits that still remained, and ate them with an excellent appetite. "MOREAU!" Through the window, I saw one of those unaccountable men in white lugging a packing case along the beach. Presently the window frame hid him. Then I heard a key inserted and turned in the lock behind me. After a little while I heard through the locked door the noise of the staghounds, which had now been brought up from the beach. They were not barking, but sniffling and growling in a curious fashion. I could hear the rapid patter of their feet, and Montgomery's voice soothing them. I was very much impressed by the elaborate secrecy of these two men regarding the contents of the place, and for some time I was thinking of that, and of the unaccountable familiarity of the name of MOREAU. But so odd is the human memory that I could not then recall that well-known name and its proper connection. From that my thoughts went to the indefinable queerness of the deformed and white-swathed man on the beach. I'd never seen such a gait, such odd motions as he pulled at the box. I recalled that none of these men had spoken to me, though most of them I had found looking at me at one time or another in a peculiar, furtive manner, quite unlike the frank stare of your unsophisticated savage. I wondered what language they spoke. They'd all seemed remarkably taciturn when they did speak, endowed with very uncanny voices. What was wrong with them? Then I recalled the eyes of Montgomery's ungainly attendant. Just as I was thinking of him, he came in. He was now dressed in white and carried a little tray with some coffee and boiled vegetables thereon. I could hardly repress a shuddering recoil as he came, bending amiably, and placed the tray before me on the table. Then astonishment paralyzed me. Under his stringy black locks, I saw his ear. It jumped upon me suddenly, close to my face. The man had pointed ears, covered with a fine fur. "Your breakfast, sir," he said. I stared at his face without attempting to answer. He turned and went towards the door, regarding me oddly over his shoulder. I followed him out with my eyes, and as I did so, by some trick of unconscious celebration, there came surging into my head the phrase, "The MOREAU Hollows," was it? The MOREAU. I'd sent my memory back 10 years. The MOREAU horrors. The phrase drifted loose in my mind for a moment, and then I saw it in red lettering on a little buff-coloured pamphlet that to read made one shiver and creep. Then I remembered distinctly all about it. That long-forgotten pamphlet came back to me with startling vividness to my mind. I'd been a mere lad then, and MOREAU was, I suppose, about 50. A prominent and masterful physiologist, well known in scientific circles for his extraordinary imagination and his brutal directness in discussions. Was this the same MOREAU? He'd published some very astonishing facts in connection with the transfusion of blood, and in addition was known to be doing valuable work on morbid growths. Then suddenly his career was closed. He'd had to leave England. A journalist had obtained access to his laboratory in the capacity of a laboratory assistant, with the deliberate intention of making sensational exposures, and by the help of a shocking accident, if it was an accident, his gruesome pamphlet became notorious. On the day of its publication, a wretched dog, flayed and otherwise mutilated, had escaped from MOREAU's house. It was in the silly season, and a prominent editor, a cousin of the temporary laboratory assistant, appealed to the conscience of the nation. It was not the first time that conscience had turned against the methods of research. The doctor was simply howled out of the country. It may be he deserved to be, but I still think the tepid support of his fellow investigators and his desertion by the great body of scientific workers was a shameful thing. Yet some of his experiments, by the journalist's account, were wantonly cruel. He might perhaps have purchased his social peace by abandoning his investigations, but he'd apparently preferred the latter, as most men would who had once fallen under the overmastering spell of research. He was unmarried, and had indeed nothing but his own interests to consider. I felt convinced this must be the same man. Everything pointed to it. It dawned upon me to what end the puma and the other animals which had now been brought with the other luggage into the enclosure behind the house were destined. And a curious faint odour, the halitus of something familiar, an odour that had been in the background of my consciousness hitherto, suddenly came forward into the foreground of my thoughts. It was the antiseptic odour of the operating room. I heard the puma growling through the wall, and one of the dogs yelped as though it had been struck. Yet surely, and especially to another scientific man, there was nothing so horrible in vivisection as to account for the secrecy. And by some odd leap in my thoughts, the pointed ears and the luminous eyes of Montgomery's attendant came back again before me with the sharpest definition. I stared before me out at the green sea, frothing under the freshening breeze, I let these and other strange memories of the last few days chase each other through my mind. What could it mean? A locked enclosure on a lonely island, a notorious vivisector, and these crippled and distorted men.